The icy wind whipped through the narrow streets of Gothenburg as Elle adjusted her oversized leather jacket, the silver chains on her belt clinking softly. Her purple hair, streaked with black, fell in sharp layers across her face, half obscuring her skeptical expression. She stood outside the convenience store where her two best friends, Freya and Mikkel, huddled over their phones, whispering excitedly about the rave they'd convinced her to attend. "I don't get why we have to be so secretive," Ellie muttered, crossing her arms. "If it's this hard to find, maybe it's not worth going." Freya rolled her eyes, her frosted blonde hair catching the streetlight. "Elle, that's the point. It's underground. Exclusive. We're not just showing up to some boring club." Mikkel grinned, flipping his phone around to show a cryptic message he'd received. Coordinates, a time, and a single word. "Nebula. You're gonna love it. Trust me." Ellie sighed, unconvinced. Her gaze wandered to the dark alley across the street, where shadows danced in the dim light. Something about the night felt off. She couldn't quite place it, but it gnawed at her, a prickling unease she couldn't shake. Still, Freya and Mikkel were relentless. Hours later, she found herself in the back seat of a car speeding toward the outskirts of the city. Industrial warehouses loomed in the distance, their skeletal frames outlined against the eerie glow of the northern lights. Elle leaned her head against the cold glass window, watching the scenery blur, her gut twisting with equal parts apprehension and curiosity. "This better be worth it," she muttered under her breath. Frasier turned in her seat, her eyes glinting with excitement. "Elle, you're too in your head. Let go for once. Just feel the music." But as they pulled into a desolate parking lot, the bass of distant music thudding through the ground, Elle's unease deepened. She caught a figure lingering near the edge of the lot, his face obscured by shadows. His posture was familiar, but she couldn't quite place why. Shrugging it off, she followed her friends into the makeshift entrance. She didn't notice the figure watching her every move. The air inside the warehouse was electric, vibrating with pulsing bass that seemed to seep into Elle's bones. Neon lights flickered erratically, casting the room in shades of purple, pink, and blue. Smoke machines clouded the space, giving everything a hazy, dreamlike quality. Elle stayed close to Freya and Mikkel as they wove through the sweaty, writhing crowd. "This is insane," Ellie said, her voice barely audible over the music. Her skepticism was waning as the energy of the rave began to wrap around her. It was chaotic, but there was something intoxicating about it, something freeing. "Told you!" Freya shouted, passing her a small silver flask. Elle hesitated for a moment, then took a sip, the burn of vodka warming her throat. Mikkel grinned, pulling them deeper into the crowd. "This is where the magic happens," he said, holding up a small pill between his fingers. Elle's stomach flipped. She wasn't the type to do drugs. She never had been. But tonight, the music, the lights, and the palpable sense of rebellion swirled in her head, making her feel invincible. "You don't have to," Freya said, noticing her hesitation, "but it'll make the night unforgettable." Elle bit her lip, then reluctantly took the pill, chasing it with another swig from the flask. Frasier whooped, pulling her into the throng of bodies. For the first few hours, it was euphoric. Elle danced like she'd never danced before, her inhibitions melting away as the music carried her. Her laughter came easily, and for the first time in years, she felt weightless. But as the hours passed, things started to blur. The lights became too bright, the music too loud, faces in the crowd twisted into unfamiliar shapes, and the room seemed to spin. "Freya?" Elle called out, her voice slurring. "Mikkel?" No answer. She stumbled through the crowd, her heart pounding in her ears. Someone caught her arm, steadying her. She looked up to see a man with piercing eyes and a face she hadn't seen in years. "Elle," he said softly, his voice cutting through the noise. Her breath caught. It was him, her ex. The one she'd thought she'd left behind. Elle's heart stopped, her mind struggling to process his face through the haze clouding her senses. "Adrian?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over the pounding bass. Her legs felt weak, and not just from the drugs. He steadied her, his grip firm but not rough. "You're not safe here," Adrian said, his voice low and urgent. His dark eyes, once so familiar, now seemed shadowed with something unreadable, something dangerous. What are you doing here?" Elle slurred, trying to pull her arm away, but her body refused to cooperate. I could ask you the same thing, he replied, his jaw tightening. You shouldn't be here, Elle. This isn't your world. Her head swam and she stumbled, nearly falling. Adrian caught her, pulling her closer. You're coming with me, he said firmly. No, my friends, she protested weakly, her vision swimming as the neon lights spun around her. I'll find them later, Adrian said. Right now you need to get out of here. She tried to resist, but her strength was no match for his. He guided her through the crowd with practiced ease, avoiding the eyes of the other ravers. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the world around her was slipping further and further away. By the time they reached the parking lot, the cold night air hit her like a slap, momentarily jolting her back to reality. Adrian's car, a sleek black sedan she didn't recognize, was parked near the edge of the lot, away from the other vehicles. Adrian! Stop, she muttered, her voice weak but firm enough to make him pause. He turned to her, his eyes softening for a moment. You don't understand, Elle. If I hadn't been here tonight, things could have gone very differently. You don't know what kind of people are inside. And you're any better, she shot back, her fear sharpening into anger. He opened the car door, his expression hardening. I don't care what you think of me right now. What matters is keeping you alive. We're leaving, whether you like it or not. Before she could protest further, she felt her body give in to exhaustion, her vision fading black as Adrian gently eased her into the car. When Elle woke, the first thing she noticed was the quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the rave. The second was the softness of the bed beneath her, far more comfortable than the sticky warehouse floors she vaguely remembered. Her head throbbed, her mouth dry, and her limbs heavy. She blinked against the dim light of a lamp on a nearby table, her eyes adjusting to her unfamiliar surroundings. The room was simple but well kept, wooden floors, clean white walls, and blackout curtains drawn tight over the windows. A faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air. Panic surged as the memory of Adrian's face flashed in her mind. Her body tensed and she bolted upright, only to find him sitting in a chair across the room, his elbows resting on his knees, watching her. You're awake, he said, his voice calm but unreadable. Elle's heart raced, her eyes darting around the room for an escape route. What the hell is this? Where am I? She demanded, her voice hoarse. You're safe, Adrian replied, standing slowly as though not to spook her. He gestured toward a glass of water on the nightstand. Drink, you'll feel better. I don't want water, she snapped. I want answers. Why did you take me? What do you want? Adrian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. You were in danger, Ella. That rave wasn't just some underground party. It was crawling with people who'd take advantage of anyone too far gone to notice. Including you. Her jaw tightened. So your solution was to kidnap me? That makes you any better? His eyes flickered with something, guilt, maybe. I wasn't going to leave you there, not after everything. Everything? She repeated, her voice sharp. You're my ex, Adrian. You don't get to decide what happens to me. He stepped closer but kept his distance. You don't understand, Elle. I've been watching out for you. I've had to. You don't know the kind of trouble you're walking into, and I couldn't just stand by. Her stomach twisted. Watching me? For how long? Since the day we broke up, he admitted softly, his voice tinged with regret. Elle stared at him, her heart pounding in disbelief. Since we broke up? You're telling me you've been following me for years? Adrian's gaze didn't waver. Yes, he said simply, his tone steady, as if he had nothing to hide. I know how it sounds. I know it makes me look insane. But there are things you don't know, things I couldn't tell you back then. Try me, she snapped, anger rising to mask her fear. Because from where I'm sitting, you're sounding exactly like the kind of dangerous person you claimed to be protecting me from. Adrian let out a long breath, as though deciding how much of the truth to reveal. The night we broke up, you remember how sudden it was? How I just left? Elle's jaw tightened. She remembered it all too well, the cold, abrupt way he'd walked out of her life with barely an explanation, leaving her broken and confused. I thought you just didn't care, she said bitterly. He shook his head, his expression pained. It wasn't that. I left because I had to. There were people after me, dangerous people, and I didn't want you caught in the crossfire. But they knew about you, Ellie. They knew you were the one thing I cared about. Her stomach flipped. What are you talking about? What people? He leaned against the wall, his posture tense. The kind of people who were at that rave. Dealers, traffickers, gangs. Sweden isn't as peaceful as it looks, Elle. I was involved in things I never should have been. When I walked away, I thought I could keep you out of it, but I was wrong. Her pulse quickened. So what, you've just been stalking me to... what? Protect me? That's insane! Adrian stepped closer, his voice softening. I know it sounds crazy, but I've been keeping you safe, whether you knew it or not. And tonight was proof that I'm right. If I hadn't been there, Elle, do you really think you'd have made it out of that rave unscathed? She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But deep down, a part of her couldn't shake the truth in his words. Elle opened her mouth to respond, to tear into Adrian for all his twisted logic and self-justification, but then she saw something flicker in his expression. A shadow, a hesitation. It wasn't just guilt or regret, it was fear. What aren't you telling me? She asked, her voice quieter now, her anger giving way to unease. Adrian's jaw clenched, his gaze dropping for a moment before he met her eyes again. There's something else, he admitted, his tone heavy with the weight of whatever he was about to say. What? She demanded, her stomach knotting. They weren't just watching me, Elle. They've been watching you too. Her blood ran cold. What do you mean? Adrian stepped closer, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves could betray them. For months now, they've been keeping tabs on you. At first I thought it was because of me, because they were trying to find a way to get to me. But it's more than that. She shook her head, backing away from him. No, you're lying. Why would anyone be interested in me? I'm nobody. Adrian hesitated and then, with visible reluctance, pulled a small envelope from his jacket pocket. Because of this. Elle snatched the envelope, her trembling hands fumbling to open it. Inside were photos, dozens of them. All of her. Walking to class, sitting in cafes, laughing with Fraser and Mickle. Some of them were from days, even weeks ago. Her heart pounded as she flipped through them, her breath catching when she reached the last photo, a picture of her standing at the edge of the rave, completely unaware, with a date and time scrawled in the corner. She looked up at Adrian, her voice trembling. You didn't take these, did you? No, he said quietly. I didn't. The air seemed to leave the room as a terrifying realization settled over her. Someone else was following me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian nodded grimly. And they were at that rave tonight, Elle. They weren't there for me. They were there for you. Her heart stopped. Why? Adrian's expression darkened. Because they know who you really are. Elle froze, her mind racing. What do you mean? Who I really am? I'm just me, she stammered, clutching the photos tightly, as if they might offer some kind of explanation. Adrian's face was etched with something that bordered on sorrow. No, Elle, you're not just you. There's more to your family than you know. She shook her head, stepping back. No, don't do that. Don't pull some cliché crap about my family. My parents are boring. My life is boring. There's nothing special about me. Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. Your parents aren't who you think they are, at least not entirely. Your father, he paused as though struggling to find the right words. He used to run with some of the most powerful criminal syndicates in Northern Europe. Elle's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. You're insane. My dad? He's an accountant. He's been an accountant my entire life. An accountant with connections, Adrian shot back. You think he just walked away from that life? People like that don't get to retire. Not without leaving loose ends, and those loose ends have led straight to you. Her head swam, the room seeming to tilt as she tried to process his words. Why would they care about me? I didn't even know any of this. That doesn't matter to them, Adrian said firmly. Your name, your blood, it's enough, your leverage, a tool to drag your father back into the game or punish him for leaving. Elle's voice cracked as she snapped, Then why didn't my dad tell me? Why didn't anyone warn me? Adrian hesitated, and his next words hit her like a truck. Because he didn't want you to know, and because he trusted me to keep you safe. Her heart stopped. What are you talking about? Adrian exhaled slowly. Your father came to me after we broke up. He knew I had connections, that I could protect you in ways he couldn't. Everything I've done since then, Elle, it's because he asked me to. Elle's knees buckled as the weight of the truth crashed down on her. You're saying my dad hired you to stalk me? To protect you. Adrian corrected, stepping closer. And now the people he feared are here. They're coming for you, Elle, and I'm the only one standing in their way. Elle felt like the floor was falling out from under her. Her father had been a criminal? Adrian had been protecting her this whole time on his orders? None of it made sense. And yet, the pieces were starting to come together. The photos, the rave, the sense of unease that had shadowed her life for months. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. But before she could respond, Adrian's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his face tightening as he picked it up. "They're moving faster than I thought," he muttered under his breath. "What do you mean?" Elle asked, her voice shaky. Adrian hesitated, then handed her the phone. On the screen was a live feed from a security camera. Her stomach twisted when she saw the image. Freya and Mikkel, tied to chairs in a dimly lit room, their faces bruised. "What the hell is this?" Ella cried, her voice breaking. "They have your friends," Adrian said grimly. "They must have grabbed them when the rave ended. They're using them to lure you out." Elle's blood ran cold. "This is because of me. They took them because of me." Adrian stepped closer, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "Listen to me, Elle. This isn't your fault. These people, your father's enemies, will do anything to draw you out. They want to use you to destroy what's left of him, but I won't let that happen. I'll get your friends back, and I'll keep you safe. You have to trust me." Elle searched his face, her emotions a storm of fear, anger, and something she hadn't expected, a flicker of warmth. Despite everything, despite the lies and the kidnapping, Adrian had risked everything to protect her. "Why are you doing this, Adrian?" she whispered, tears in her eyes. His grip on her shoulders tightened slightly, and his voice softened. "Because it was never just about your father. Not for me. I left because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. But I never stopped caring about you. I never stopped loving you, Elle." Her breath caught. Before she could respond, Adrian's phone buzzed again. A single text. "We want her. 1 hour." And just like that, the storm inside her was overtaken by a singular, chilling realization. There was no way out of this without risking everything. Elle's heart raced as she stared at the message on Adrian's phone. The world felt impossibly heavy, like every decision she made from this moment forward could break her, or someone she loved. Freya and Mikkel's faces haunted her mind, but it was Adrian's presence, steady and close, that kept her from spiraling. "You love me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. Adrian's eyes softened, his usual stoic demeanour faltering for the first time. "I never stopped, Elle, even when I walked away, especially then." He hesitated, as though unsure if he should continue. "I thought staying out of your life was the best way to keep you safe, but I was wrong. Every time I saw you from a distance, it hurt, knowing I couldn't be part of your life, knowing I couldn't tell you how much I cared." Her breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes. "You should have told me," she said, her voice cracking. "Maybe we could have—" "I couldn't." He interrupted gently. "I was too scared of what I'd bring into your life, of the danger I'd put you in. But now I'm done hiding. I'd rather you hate me for dragging you into this mess than lose you altogether." For a moment, the weight of his confession settled between them, heavy and raw. Elle didn't know what to say. She wanted to be angry at him, to tell him she couldn't forgive him. But the way he was looking at her, like she was the only thing keeping him grounded, made it impossible. Without thinking, she closed the space between them. Her hands, trembling but resolute, reached up to cup his face. "You've turned my entire world upside down, Adrian, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you for everything you've done. But right now, you're all I have." His breath caught as her words sank in, and before she could second-guess herself, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was hesitant at first, but as he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer, it deepened into something fierce, something desperate, like two people clinging to each other in the face of a storm. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, his voice a whisper. "I swear, Elle, I'll fix this. I'll get your friends back, and I'll prove to you that I'm worth trusting." For the first time, she believed him, and that terrified her more than anything else. Elle's heart was still pounding from the kiss, her mind spinning with the weight of everything Adrian had just confessed. She barely had time to process the intensity of it all when the lights in the room flickered and a faint hum filled the air. Adrian stiffened immediately, pulling her behind him as he reached for his phone. His eyes darted to the live feed showing Freya and Mikkel, and Elle's stomach dropped when she noticed something off. Freya was looking directly into the camera, her eyes wide, and she was shaking her head ever so slightly. Adrian swiped to another screen, his brows furrowing as he scanned the camera feeds. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "What is it?" Elle asked, her voice shaky. Before he could answer, the screen went black. The hum grew louder, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Adrian grabbed Elle's wrist, his expression grim. "We need to move, now." "But my friends," she began, panic rising in her chest. "Elle, it's a setup," Adrian said firmly, his voice steady but urgent. "They were never holding your friends. This was all to lure us out. They're already here." Her blood turned to ice. "What? But the photos?" "Fake," Adrian said, pulling her toward the door. "It's all been orchestrated to trap us. They wanted me to bring you here." As if to confirm his words, the door to the room burst open and 3 men in black stormed in, weapons drawn. Adrian reacted instantly, shoving Elle behind him as he pulled his own gun, firing 2 quick shots that sent the men diving for cover. "This way!" Adrian yelled, dragging her toward a side door. The sound of more footsteps echoed through the halls, closing in fast. Adrenaline surged through Elle as they ran, her mind struggling to keep up with the sheer chaos. "Where are we even going?" she shouted. "To safety," Adrian growled. "And then we figure out who's really behind this." As they burst into the freezing night air, Elle realized that nothing, her father's secrets, Adrian's love, or even her own life, was as it seemed. The icy night air hit Elle's face like a slap, her lungs burning as she and Adrian sprinted through the dark alley behind the building. Her heart pounded, but her fear only grew as Adrian abruptly slowed, glancing over his shoulder. "What is it?" she asked breathlessly, her voice trembling. Adrian didn't answer immediately. His jaw was tight, his hand still gripping hers. "We're not alone," he said finally, his voice low and sharp. Elle froze, her eyes darting around the dark alley. The shadows seemed to move, twisting and shifting as though alive. The hum of distant machinery from the warehouse faded, leaving an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. And then she saw them, figures emerging from the darkness. There were at least 10 of them, dressed in black and wearing masks that reflected the faint glow of the streetlights. They moved in perfect unison, blocking every exit. Elle's breath hitched as one of the masked figures stepped forward, their face entirely hidden except for piercing, bright blue eyes. They spoke, their voice distorted by some kind of modulator, making it unrecognizable. "Hello, Elle," the figure said, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "We've been waiting for you." Adrian stepped in front of her, his gun raised. "Stay back," he warned, his tone cold and commanding. The figure laughed, the sound mechanical and hollow. "Put the gun down, Adrian. You know it won't help. You've been playing the hero long enough." Elle's hands began to shake. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The figure tilted their head, their unsettling blue eyes locking onto her. "The truth," they said simply. "The truth about you." Before she could react, a flash of light erupted from behind the group, blinding her. Adrian grabbed her, pulling her to the ground just as something exploded nearby, the force of the blast throwing debris and smoke into the air. As her ears rang and the world spun, a horrifying realization gripped Elle. Whoever these people were, they hadn't just been watching her. They knew something about her that even she didn't know. And now, they were willing to burn everything down to get her. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow on the quiet forest where Elle and Adrian had finally stopped running. The chaos of the night felt like a distant nightmare, though the dried blood on Adrian's shirt and the ache in Elle's legs reminded her it had been all too real. They sat on a moss-covered log near a small clearing, the crisp morning air biting at their skin. Adrian had built a small fire, its warmth a welcome comfort after hours of freezing tension. He sat beside her, silent, his expression thoughtful as he watched the flames dance. Elle hugged her knees to her chest, her purple hair wild and tangled from the night's ordeal. "Do you think it's over?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian glanced at her, the harshness he carried in the heat of battle replaced by a gentler, almost tender look. For now, he said, we bought ourselves some time, but I don't think they'll stop until they get what they're after. Elle let out a shaky breath. What are they even after, Adrian? What could possibly be so important about me? Adrian hesitated, then reached over and took her hand in his. His touch was warm and steady, grounding her. They don't understand what you mean to me, he said, avoiding her question. And as long as I'm breathing, I won't let them touch you. She stared at him, her heart tightening. For so long, she'd felt like her life was spinning out of control, but in this moment, with Adrian beside her, she felt safe, maybe for the first time in years. You can't protect me forever, she said, though there was no bitterness in her tone, just quiet acceptance. Maybe not, he admitted, squeezing her hand. But I'll try, because I love you, Elle. And that's not something they can take from us. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't from fear. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the warmth of the fire and the dawn's light washing over them. For now they had this moment. And it was enough. As Elle rested her head against Adrian's shoulder, the warmth of the fire and the dawn's soft glow lulled her into a strange calm. But then, like a bolt of lightning, a memory surfaced, so vivid it made her gasp aloud, jerking upright. Elle? Adrian asked, his voice sharp with concern. Her eyes widened, unfocused, as the flashback overwhelmed her. It was a summer day, years ago. She couldn't have been older than 8, sitting on the worn wooden floor of her family's cabin, deep in the Swedish countryside. Her father was there, kneeling in front of her, his hands trembling as he packed a black duffel bag. You have to be brave, Elle, he said, his voice steady but his eyes full of fear. No matter what happens, you can't tell anyone about this. Not your friends, not your teachers, no one. She'd clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, confused and scared. Why, Daddy? What's going on? He had paused, cupping her small face in his hands. There are people out there who would hurt you to hurt me. Bad people. If anything ever happens to me, you go to Adrian. Adrian? She'd echoed, frowning. Who's Adrian? Her father glanced toward the window as though someone might be listening. He'll find you when you need him most. He's a good man, Elle. He'll keep you safe. Then he zipped up the bag and pressed a pendant into her hand, a small silver disc with an engraving she hadn't understood back then. Don't ever lose this, he'd said. It'll tell him who you are. The memory snapped back to the present like a rubber band, and Elle's hand instinctively went to her neck. She hadn't thought about the pendant in years, but there it was, resting against her chest beneath her shirt. Her breath caught as she looked at Adrian. You knew my father, didn't you? Adrian's face softened, pain flashing in his eyes. He saved my life once, and he asked me to save yours in return. The weight of the truth settled over her like a heavy blanket. Everything, her father's warnings, Adrian's constant presence, suddenly made sense. Elle's fingers tightened around the pendant, the silver cool against her palm. The weight of the flashback sat heavy in her chest, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even realized she was trying to solve. Her father's cryptic warnings, Adrian's relentless presence, the people chasing her, it all tied back to this. You didn't just know him, Ella whispered, her voice trembling. You were part of his world, weren't you? Adrian's jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the flames. I was, he admitted after a moment. Your father was. One of the few people who believed I could be more than the mess I was. He gave me a way out. He gave me purpose. Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but it only raised more questions. Then why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he explain any of this to me? Adrian finally looked at her, his dark eyes filled with regret. Because he didn't want this life to touch you. He wanted you to have a normal life, a chance to grow up without looking over your shoulder. That's why he made me promise to stay in the shadows, to watch over you from afar. Elle swallowed hard, her emotions a swirling mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sort of gratitude. So all this time, all the times I thought I was imagining someone watching me, or when things just seemed to work out, I wasn't crazy. That was you. Adrian nodded. Every time. And when I saw the first signs that they were tracking you, I knew it was only a matter of time before they made their move. That's why I showed up. I couldn't let them get to you first. She let his words settle over her, her fingers still clutching the pendant. The reality of her father's choices and Adrian's role in her life was overwhelming, but as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that anchored her. Devotion. "I hated you for so long," she said quietly, "for leaving, for the secrets. But now," her voice broke slightly, "now I don't know how to feel." Adrian reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Then don't decide right now. Just know that everything I've done has been for you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "I believe you, Adrian. I think I always did." The sun had fully risen now, bathing the forest in soft light that filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the clearing. The chaos of the night felt far away, though the tension still lingered between them like unspoken words. Elle looked down at the pendant in her hand, its engraved surface catching the light. She traced the pattern with her thumb, a quiet symbol of her father's love and the complicated web of protection he'd woven around her. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was the key to everything. She turned to Adrian, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. His face, usually so guarded, was open now, raw with emotion. For the first time, she truly saw him. Not the shadowy figure from her past or the overprotective force in her life, but the man who had risked everything to keep her safe. "I don't know how to move forward," Elle admitted, her voice soft. "Everything I thought I knew about my life, about you, it's all gone. But," she hesitated, her voice catching, "I know I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, and I don't think I've ever said thank you." Adrian shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't have to thank me, Elle. Protecting you isn't something I did out of obligation. I did it because I care about you, because I always have." Her chest tightened, a warmth spreading through her that she hadn't felt in years. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You've been in my corner this whole time, haven't you?" "Always," Adrian said, his voice steady, "and I'll stay there as long as you let me." Elle held his gaze, the weight of the night lifting ever so slightly. "Then maybe it's time I stopped running from you," she said, a small, genuine smile breaking through. For the first time, in the quiet of the morning, the fear melted away. In its place was something fragile yet unshakable, hope. Together they stood, ready to face whatever came next. For now it was enough.